Good evening from New York and good morning to our audience in Asia. I'm Sherry Yan. I'm an anchor at Bloomberg Television. Now, in the last few months, one of the key points of discussion in the markets has been the incredible ascent of growth stocks led by technology giants and those companies that are benefiting from the stay-at-home trade. We're seeing this pandemic-induced digital revolution really that has been turbocharged by people staying at homes and using the digital technologies in order to connect. And this coming at a time when we're seeing growing tensions between the US and China, also growing tensions within countries with tech regulators and the concentration of power in these tech giants. The biggest news this afternoon here in the US was antitrust action against Facebook, not to mention, of course, we have action against Google just in October. So in the next hour, we want to discuss the implications of this pandemic-induced digital revolution, not to mention the competition between economies in advanced technologies, also the vulnerabilities that this really brings in a very interconnected world, and perhaps give some ideas of a sense of a framework when it comes to digital governance. And we have an amazing panel to discuss all of this. Ian Bremmer, who's the president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and we thank him for hosting us. We also have Hiroshi Kajiyama, who's the Minister of Economy, Trade, and Industry of Japan. Jane-Ho Lut, President and CEO, SIGPA North America. We also have Bob Moritz, Global Chairman of the PwC Network. And very shortly, we'll be joined by Eric Schmidt, co-founder, Schmidt Futures, and former CEO and Executive Chairman of Google. We'll kick things off with this conversation with Minister Kajiyama's speech about Japan's role in global policymaking on digitalization, data, technological innovation in this time of COVID-19. Minister Kajiyama, over to you.
Hello, people of the world. I am Kajiyama Hiroshi, Minister of Economy, Trade, and Industry of Japan. Mr. Bremmer, Mr. Nakanishi, thank you very much for inviting me again this year following the last year's meeting. Since I took the podium a year ago, the world scenery changed drastically. Mankind fears the threat of COVID every day, wears masks always, and avoids getting crowded, and meets online. The normal that we took for granted overturned completely. The big changes occurred in daily lives, but world order seems to be moving as expected. US-China rivalry over hegemony is intensifying. The function of international organizations are degrading. The geo-economic assessment presented at last year's G0 summit contained accurate predictions of what to come. The unexpected COVID crisis ruthlessly exposed a social confrontation and divide around the US presidential election and probably accelerated the predicted changes. Pandemic accelerates the restructuring of international order and social transformation. This is a lesson that history taught us. The accurate take on the lesson is to put a stop to the chain and the expansion of fragmentation and muster wisdom to bring back cooperation that mankind desperately needs. The world is wandering, losing confidence, and doesn't know which path to take. The vision for the globalized world connected across borders need to be rebuilt. Shine a light on the path that the world should take. The role of this summit is more important than even the last year's. The world trembles in the horror of the pandemic and continues to divide. My country first attitude is rampant. As the intense US-China rivalry shows, the powerful centrifugal forces working on international cooperation like never before. Impact of the pandemic is relatively moderate in Japan, and social solidarity is a bit stronger than compared with that of the West. Now is a time for Japan to shine a light on the path that the world should take. Japan will lead the world with 3 theses for living with the virus world. First thesis is to rebuild free and fair economic space. The pandemic disrupted global supply chain, and during the peak period, more than 80 countries applied export restrictions. Policy authorities are more tempted to be protectionistic. Time will not wait for us for the supply chain review. However, supply chain should not be closed within one's own borders. The global linkage should not be cut. What is needed is rule-based order. Carrying the torch of free trade, Japan has led the TPP and Japan-EU EPA. Through early entering into force of RCEP and expanding TPP 11 to countries who fulfill high-level conditions, Japan will continue to lead in spreading free and fair rules in the world. In addition, mindful of the state capitalistic moves, to ensure a level playing field for businesses, Japan will cooperate with like-minded countries and advance rulemaking on industrial subsidies and forced technology transfer. Second thesis is digital transformation. The phase of discussion is over. Next is implementation. Japan is catching up with Asia. Having the sense of urgency and crisis, Japan will proceed with the DX. The innovation of digital society is predicated on architecture, which is the design plan. Digital Architecture Design Center launched in May is noteworthy, as this is an organization to innovate the innovation. Beyond the DX development lies a rulemaking in the world. Digital protectionism is a threat to expanding data flow and digital economy. International rules are needed now on free data flow based on trust for privacy and security. Japan is at the center of digital rulemaking. So far, through TPP, Japan-US Digital Agreement, Japan-UK EPA, and RCEP, network for free data flow has been widened. Based on data free flow with trust agreed at the G20 Osaka Summit, Japan will lead WTO e-commerce negotiation. Third thesis is realization of 2050 carbon neutral. The core element is progressive innovation that engenders virtuous cycle of economy and environment. Closing within one's borders will not help innovation grow bigger. International cooperation is indispensable here. Coming to this year, Zero Emission Center was established, headed by Dr. Yoshino, Nobel laureate of chemistry. R&D will strongly be pushed on environment and energy technology, including carbon recycling and hydrogen. Declaration to aim to realize carbon neutral is growth strategy per se that will bring about open business opportunities. As a hub for international cooperation to put green growth into action, Japan will lead the world. Going around the world, tending to tough negotiation with my counterpart, the economic minister, across the table. That was the image of a meeting minister, pre-corona. But now, either midnight or early in the morning, I attend a virtual meeting bilaterally or internationally. This is a new normal for the international negotiation, which I got used to. I now understand that our virtual talks is manageable and the world keeps on moving. Government and the industry should have a version upgrade of their own. Where there is a way, where there is a will, there is a way. By decoding the big flow of history and the world with whom will reform will be pushed. We like to change Japan and the world in a correct way. I wish well the participants of G0 Summit. May today's discussion bring about the best of wisdom that will guide the world. Thank you so much.
Minister Kajiyama, thank you very much for joining us today. Minister Kajiyama will now be leaving us, and we will have this panel discussion. And we also want to welcome Eric Schmidt, who's joining us right now. Let's just start deciphering what Minister Kajiyama just told us, because he was talking about being able to survive in this COVID-19 world, right? We've all adjusted to this virtual interaction, and I think we're getting there. We're getting more used to what's happening right now. But he also talked about fragmentation. He talked about perhaps rising protectionism. We have seen the supply chain disruptions. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening on that front, especially when it comes to technology. And I want to start with Ian, because I know that Eurasia Group has called tech decoupling the single most impactful geopolitical development for globalization since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Give us a sense of what's happening right now.
Well, thank you so much, and good to see so many friends here. I do want to say that in terms of us getting used to it, finding a way to adapt to coronavirus, let's be clear that the us we're talking about is pretty rarefied air. And there are all sorts of people all around the world that aren't getting used to it because they can't socially distance, because their jobs have gone away, because they're not a part of the knowledge economy. And if governments aren't able to respond effectively, we're going to have so much more disenfranchisement that'll cause a lot more political instability. So that is a big question, and I think it's important for us to recognize that, especially those of us that are so fortunate to be participating in this. But the tech decoupling we're talking about, if I think about the last 50 years, if I think about the Chinese model, and I think about the extraordinary growth that China has had, a growth that has come from globalization, from the increasing movement of goods and services and people and capital and data around the world faster and faster. I mean, not only is that an extraordinary rise of a country changing the nature of the global economy that is never done before at scale, but also it was done and welcomed by the advanced industrial economies, by Japan, by the United States, by the Europeans, and welcomed by our corporations. And indeed, almost every good story out there, global story, whether we're talking about the ability of us to live longer and healthier lives, or better education, bringing people out of poverty, bringing women into the workplace, all of this has grown on the back of globalization. So we're all pro-globalization here. And yet, when we think about what's happened in the technology space, the digital space, the data space over the last 5 years, what we've seen is an extraordinary shift in trajectory, a decoupling between the United States and China. It's come in part because the Chinese government has been unwilling to allow in some of the most important global technology firms in the world, most of which happen to be based in the United States. It's also because China has a state capitalist model with its own technology firms. So China today is a technology superpower. So is the United States, and we're fighting. We're fighting in the data space. We're fighting in the 5G space, which is really about the operating system for anything with the chip in it. And that is growing. We're increasingly fighting over digital currency. We're increasingly fighting over financial technology firms, fintech. When I think about the pullback in China of Alibaba's IPO that would have been the largest IPO in the world, that's not just about Jack Ma being a rogue element that Xi Jinping didn't like. It's also about the Chinese government recognizing that they want fintech to be a national champion, and they want alignment of that sector, and that's going to make it harder for the West to align. So here we are in 2020. Here we are looking at a shift from a Trump administration to a Biden administration, and the only change in their view on China technology is that the Biden administration is going to try to work in a more cooperative way with the American tech sector and also with American allies. But their concerns about Chinese technology is virtually identical to that of the Trump administration. It's very hard to find that on any issue between Trump and Biden. So yes, look, final thing I would say is that this is not the end of globalization. It's not a Cold War between the United States and China. American farmers will still be selling commodities to China in 5 years' time. We will still be welcoming Chinese tourists to come to the United States. Chinese will still want to send their kids to American universities. If you go to Walmart, you'll still be buying Chinese manufactured goods on the shelves in 5 years. Those things are all true. But the expansion of the technology Cold War, because the expansion of data and its importance in the global economy right now is heading on a trajectory that is increasingly a dramatic change in the way we think about globalization. And if the promise of globalization, supported by the West, bringing the Chinese into the global economy, has been responsible for so many of the good global stories in the last 50 years, I fear that the change in the trajectory of globalization because of the tech decoupling, because of the technology Cold War that I think we are presently in between the US and China, I think that's going to be behind a lot of stories that we're not going to like quite so much.
Right. Let me turn to Eric. So we have talked about this fragmentation, and you have talked about this fragmentation for a couple of years now. Is that what you're seeing right now? And how optimistic are you, as Ian said, about the future of globalization and where this will lead us?
Well, first, thank you for having me. It's great to see everybody. I have a pretty strong opinion that we need to use the right language here. And that when we start talking about Cold War and Hard War, we're doing a disservice to what's going on. So I want to emphasize language matters. It's pretty clear to me that we've gone from a transition where the US was dominant to what I'm going to call is a stable tension. And the stable tension, which is not the same thing as a Cold War, is a concept of these kinds of interactions where one company is leading, one platform is leading, and everyone's upset, by the way, on both sides. And Americans are not used to this, but most of the rest of the world is. This does not mean the end of globalization at all. And so what and I'm particularly attuned to what will happen with AI, because AI is a game changer on many, many levels. And AI will transform science and health and information in all sorts of ways we can talk about. But there's going to be a race for global platforms. China is ahead in a number of them. The West, in particular, the United States, is ahead in a number of others. It's a competition. And the mechanisms and the things we do will determine both who the winners are, but also where the economic growth will be and where personal freedom will be. I believe that the West, and in particular the United States, with its allies, Japan, India, South Korea, et cetera, should renew our commitment to global technology and platform leadership, and also for personal freedom in the way that we conceptualize it here in the West. And there's a lot of things that we can do, but basically we're going to, if we don't get our act together, we're going to end up in a situation where we're dealing with Huawei and TikTok, which we don't have a very good dialogue to deal with. I want us to invent in the West better versions of everything the Chinese are doing. And I'm sure the Chinese would prefer to build better versions of everything we're doing on Chinese terms. That is a stable competitive tension.
Does that
What I was going to say is you can have...
Please go ahead.
I want to add one more thing. In structure, you can have cooperation without trust. And I think that's what's missed here. Everyone has the simple model of we trust, we don't trust. You can have a perfectly fine cooperation without any trust between the two players.
And in that subject of trust, I do want to turn to Jane in a little bit, but I want to ask you one more question, Eric. When we talk about competition, when you talk about competition, is this fair competition, given that it's not necessarily private companies competing against each other here from the US and China? We have an industrial policy in China, and we don't have one here in the United States.
Well, I don't know what fair competition means in a global context. It seems to me that China has different rules, and we have different rules. It's a stable tension. It is a competition, and as long as it doesn't get completely out of control in the form of a Cold War or a hot war, we're going to have to deal with their policies. You may not like the Chinese rules about intellectual property, but you can't force them to change them. One of the things that's interesting is that in the many other Asian countries that did not have intellectual property laws, as the domestic industry evolved, intellectual property became more important. And when we conceptualize China, we always forget that the first competitor in China is the other Chinese companies, because the competition there is so strong, and that may help us there.
Jane, let me turn to you, because of course you have extensive opinions when it comes to this issue of trust.
I do. I work for a privately held Swiss company that makes the material security technology for most of the world's currency, most of the world's banknotes. We trade in trust every day, and with a technology that's forensically survivable. I mean, fundamentally, we live in a world right now where no one, nobody, no organization, no enterprise, no government is self-authenticating. Take my word for it. Nobody's going to take anybody's word for anything. We require high fidelity third party authentication of everything for trust. I mean, what is trust fundamentally? It's an ability to deliver a value proposition reliably. I trust that you will get this wrong consistently, or I trust that you will do good things consistently. So really, that's trust. And when it comes to sort of thinking about the complex of interactions we call globalization, I'm reminded of the challenges of cybersecurity, and I think there are really only three interesting questions, both on the issue of globalization and on the issue of cybersecurity, and they're roughly the same. Question number one. How do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Question number two, how do we safeguard the integrity of our information and our identity in an open and free exchange? Because that's fundamentally, I think, what Eric and both of them were talking about. That's what we want. Question number three, what should the role of government be? So when we think about this, particularly in this era of sort of what I call a global cyber awakening, where people feel empowered by the internet, by access. We are now deminiaturized. We've been miniaturized our whole lives by our governments, by society, by groups. We're Jewish. Oh, we're an American. Oh, we're Chinese. Oh, we're whatever we are. And the internet allows us to deminiaturize ourselves, and we like that empowerment. And at the same time, we're angry as hell because our public institutions, to many of us, seem no longer to be weight-bearing for the expectations that we have ladled on them, whether or not that's fair. So when it comes to trust, what we take is, what we take is sort of like, what's the economy of trust? There is an economy. I mean, just as there is a global economy and supply chains that feed that economy, there are supply chains of trouble. And there are supply chains of trust. There is an economy of trust. And if we're going to do this reconnection between us globally, which I think broke down with the end of the superpower antagonism and the threat of global nuclear annihilation, that's when our connection globally really broke down. It doesn't matter what happens in other parts of the world anymore because we're not headed to nuclear war. In order to rebuild our connection, we've got to start from scratch.
Bob, in this environment, how do companies navigate this when you're advising them? What do you tell them to do?
So let me build on a few things that were said by the panelists, but try not to repeat. As we engage with the CEOs around the world, they clearly have the phenomenon that we're all starting to see, which is not necessarily just satisfying their investors, but dealing with the broader stakeholder group. In order to do that, they've got to be more trusted and have the confidence with those stakeholders all in, and they've got to deliver the results and the outcomes that those stakeholders desire. This digital transformation that the world is undergoing at record pace and unbelievable scale causes them a couple of challenges. How do I actually transform in a world, as Eric said, that's got that stable tension? But that stable tension, any given day, has got a lot of volatility and maybe feels really close to those words, Cold War, nuclear options, or otherwise. But over time, over the time frame that these organizations are focused on, they've got to deliver the transformation that's necessary. So let's talk about what it takes to get there, because we definitely see a difference between those companies that are doing well and will thrive in today's world versus those that are not. First off, they've got to actually deliver on leveraging data. The challenge is how they get more access to it, how do they have good quality in it, how do they organize it, how do they protect it, which goes to some of the cyber points and other things that Jane talked about. The second thing is they're going to have to learn to leverage the new technologies like cloud on a broad scale basis and operationalize everything they do, be it the management of their workforce, the customer experience, or the supply chain that has been disrupted as you look at what COVID did in the last 9 months or so. The third thing they've got to do, though, is upskill their people, upskill their leadership. Otherwise, all of the data that may be available, all the technologies that they might be able to leverage go to waste. And in skilling, you've got to actually skill the workforce to create the bots and the apps and change the fundamental work gets done. You need to actually scale that innovation really important to do because everybody's doing some element of it, but not necessarily in scale. And you've got to focus on the upskilling necessary to adopt in a broad basis to get the results. And the other part of the skilling is leadership. Leadership needs to understand what it takes to drive the change in this world that we're dealing with all of those uncertainties that Ian and Eric and Jane just talked about. And then you're able to bring this to life in terms of what they can do. And they've got to do that to deliver the results to those stakeholders, but they have an also bigger role to play, which is they've got to figure out what can they control, what they can influence, and what they can't, and be really smart about the time and energy they spend. And this is where it's going to be important for the leaders of the business community to engage with government as we think about the broader need for some of the frameworks and some of the ideas that are out there.
Ian, let me turn to you and this idea of leadership, because of course we have seen in the past few years the United States sort of take a back seat when it comes to multilateralism. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts of where this is headed in this very fragmented environment and your thoughts about this idea of stable tension.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad Bob brought it up because there is clearly leadership from China on what they want to do strategically in the fields of new technologies, around climate technologies, around infrastructure, around advanced technology and AI. And, you know, Xi Jinping, he's made his speeches about wanting to have, you know, world class AI driven by the Chinese government. He's picking national champions and doing everything they can to promote them in China and to export. It's under Xi that you have Belt and Road. It's under Xi that you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the rest. The United States has not been sure what kind of leadership it wants to have. It's been withdrawing from multilateral institutions. The country is by far the most divided politically of advanced industrial democracies. And today, more Chinese feel like the China dream works for them than Americans support the American dream. That's a problem. But I want to point out that, you know, just a year ago, you had Emmanuel Macron saying NATO was brain dead. And now you hear him saying that he actually wants to try to revitalize it. You heard the Europeans saying they wanted a third way in technology, neither American nor Chinese. You now hear European leaders say they want a transatlantic partnership with the United States on new technologies. That, yeah, it's true that nobody trusts anybody, but at the same time, there's much more comfort with a private sector driven technology sphere with rule of law and independent judiciary, as you find in the United States and Europe, however imperfect, and Japan and Canada and Australia, than a state capitalist authoritarian system driven by China. And that makes me more optimistic that we are heading in a direction that looks more like the call to not arms, but the call to effective competition that Eric has made. There is a problem.
Here in the United States, have we been leaning here in Washington towards industrial policy, sort of China-like industrial policy, though?
Yeah, the answer is no. And that was actually, I'm glad you asked that, because that was the point I wanted to make. I mean, right now, the United States does not know what it wants in terms of technology strategy. We know that we're angry about technology. We're dissatisfied. But if you, depending on who you talk to, we're dissatisfied about very different things. The entire national security complex is dissatisfied that China has become a tech superpower and we have to compete with them. We don't like that. You got a lot of other people that are dissatisfied that tech companies are making all this money. And, you know, there's too much inequality in the United States. And so we need more taxes. There are other people that are dissatisfied that the freedom of speech seems to be, you know, not properly handled. And we need to treat these social media platforms as utilities. And we need more intrusive regulation. You have other people that are dissatisfied that they seem to act like monopolies in the American space. And we should break them up. And as long as everyone's angry about tech, and they're all angry about completely different things, it is very unlikely that the US government is going to be able to create a strategy that will more effectively compete with China. Now, the American companies can still do that, but they won't be supported by, aligned with the government, and that makes it harder. Clearly, it's a lot easier if we have a government that's really investing in STEM education, that's really investing in the kind of rural infrastructure we need, that's really investing in the kind of equality of opportunity that will make people less angry and less wanting to engage in the techlash that we see today.
Eric, you've in fact talked about this lack of funding of basic research here in the United States and how it's falling behind rivals. What do you think?
So let's start with the data that the United States is now spending a less percentage of GDP on basic R&D since the Sputnik crisis of the late 1950s. So we are underinvesting, in my opinion, in our future. We've also managed to destroy many of our transnational partnerships with our very close allies in Europe, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and I would argue India as well. So we can win if we renew our system, the one that got us, and in particular me, to where I am, which is this very unique and very powerful public-private partnership. And I'm quite sure the Biden administration understands this, and I'm quite sure the Biden administration will try to restore it. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of economic success in our country, health success in our country, national security success has been linked to the funding of basic science and basic research, which started with Vannevar Bush in 1945, for which we are all very grateful.
Jane, of course, you have extensive experience both in the public and private sector. What are your thoughts?
So I think it's certainly been visible to me that over the last 20 years, the governments generally across the world have lost the corner on the market on three key areas that they used to dominate: the control of lethality, the control of capital, and the control of rulemaking. And let's just take fundamentally this question of security. I mean, governments have believed themselves to be not only market participants, but the dominant player, indeed the monopolists on security. And when you think about life today, security has a physical dimension. It also has a cyber dimension, right? And governments approach security, they all approach it the same way. And that is strategic, centralized, and top-driven. And I can't think of three more useless words in the English language to describe what's happening online and in cyberspace today than strategic, centralized, and top-driven. And part of the reason governments are adrift, and I want to come back to a point Eric made earlier, is our vocabulary is not serving us well. In fact, it's lame. And it reveals that perhaps our ideas are lame. In my world, that is the world of international and violent conflict. We call conflicts ethnic or religious. That gives us no insight whatsoever into why people are moved to kill each other over these differences. And the anger that Ian was talking about earlier is anxiety-based anger. This is not purpose-driven anger. When you have purpose-driven anger, people do kill each other. When you have anxiety-based anger, you see what you're seeing now. And so, yes, we are a divided United States. And yes, governments are struggling globally with the loss of control, which is why I'm a little less certain that we're in an environment of stable competition or stable tension. In my conversations with a number of governments in the developing world, they feel as though the rules were set against them for centuries. And the vast acceleration and the development, economic development, social development, political development was driven by the West to the disadvantage of the rest. And so I don't think we're done yet. I don't think China is done. I don't think the global South is done making up for lost ground. And I think we're seeing that very clearly in the emergence of four very powerful norms. Number one, the norm of inclusivity. Nothing about me without me. And we see that at every level of government, at the international level, at the national level, and at the subnational level. The second norm is transparency. People want to know what's going on. And that norm is translating from the public sector into the private sector. The third norm is reciprocity. If you're going to require me to do this, you better be doing it as well, and vice versa. And the fourth norm is accountability. So I think feels like a less stable tension. Maybe I'm less certain of the stability of this tension, I should say, than Eric is.
And I think, of course, exacerbating this. Please go ahead.
Can I add something? The reason I listened to that and I understand your logic, and I'm sure everything you said is true. I believe that the technology and the platforms that are building will favor a relatively small number of players. And this creates this enormous problem where countries, let's call them middle countries, want to have their own identity. But the reality is that the platforms are so powerful, they have to choose. And I agree with your statement that the tension is there. But I will tell you that the scale effects of technology and where we are in technology in general will favor large organized initiatives, which will be the domain of a number of large countries, and that the smaller and mid-sized countries are not going to have the wealth, the people, the talent, the networks to pull it off. And that is the conundrum that I think explains the tension that you just described.
I have a point I want to make.
I agree with that.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
The only thing I would say to that is,
thank you.
You know, as you look at the world in that model, Eric, countries then fall into three categories, right? The regional anchors, the big regional countries. I mean, it's hard to imagine, the southern half of Africa succeeding if South Africa doesn't succeed. I mean, there are regional anchors, there are regional cankers to what you are describing, and there are the regional rest. And that actually describes the world as it has been for the last 150 or 200 years as well. It's just that the ownership of the platforms is changing.
Ian.
Sure. Well, I mean, very briefly, I want to square the circle here. I think that I agree with Eric that it is stable in the sense that it's the United States and China, and for the foreseeable future, nobody else is going to have that kind of scale. Absolutely. And coronavirus makes that a stronger stability, not a weaker one. But let's also recognize that the geopolitical order underneath all of this is not stable at all, right? Because what you have are architecture and institutions that were created to reflect an order that does not in any way reflect the technology systems that we're talking about right now. They don't. Not our economic institutions, not the way we engage in capitalism, not the Chinese economic model, and perhaps more importantly, not the system of alliances and other rule-making institutions around the world that were much more inclusive, multilateral, US-driven with a bunch of allies. That's not where we are going forward. So may well be that this new T2, as I call it, sort of technology balance with a very small number of players in America and China, that's going to be stable for 10 or 20 years or more. But the geopolitical order of GZERO cannot persist that long without things breaking. And I worry deeply about that for some of the reasons that Jane just mentioned.
Bob, do companies have to worry about this as well? Is that something that you consider?
Absolutely. But let me come back to something Jane said when she described sort of the three layers out there, your regional anchors, your cankers, and then everybody else. In speaking with a prime minister recently, that's probably in that second bucket, they would acknowledge that world, that reality that's going to be there for the next 10 and 20 years. And the question that we've debated with him now is, okay, what are you doing for the benefit of your citizens to deal with the major challenges that are out there? And how can you, going back to Eric's point, bring the public partnership concepts together to deal with the infrastructure issues and needs, as well as the education, to take advantage of the opportunities that a China and a US are going to provide for you in one way, shape, or form. And on any given day, it could be one or the other, or maybe both. And it's probably going to be a combination when you look at this particular country, which is sort of squarely in the middle from a Western and an Eastern perspective right now. Coming back to your question, Sherry, the CEO community absolutely has to play this issue out, because with all due respect to the minister, there's a practical reality that we're not going to get to global standards anytime soon. It's this hybrid world that they've got to live in, which results in them having to deal with more complexity, more cost, more friction amongst the systems in terms of how to operationalize their businesses, and making some tough choices about what to do and not to do strategically, i.e., do I want to play in China and some related countries or not? And if I am, here's the rules of the game, and those rules may be different than the rest of the world. Some companies have said it's a binary decision, yay or nay. Others have said, I'm going to work both angles. And that's the strategic plan, of which then they've got to get the right leaders and the right connections to move this ball forward. And that's the crazy world that they're in, but they're acknowledging and taking advantage of it right now.
And I'm going to get to the digital governance framework very soon. But before we get there, and perhaps ideas of how to get there, we have to talk about more of the vulnerabilities and the complexity of the world that we're living in right now, especially with COVID-19, the cyber vulnerabilities. Of course, we are all connecting from home through less secure systems. We have state-backed actors, of course, as well, that have been trying to hack into vaccine research and so forth. Let's start with Jane, because you're a cybersecurity expert, but you've also have worked as a Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. How vulnerable are we right now?
I mean, the question sort of really begins with how reliant are we, on IT and access to the internet. I mean, and on and truly understanding the importance of data liquidity. And the answer is our reliance is complete. I mean, there's no enterprise that delivers value in any market that we're talking about without relying on IT, access to the internet, and a command of data liquidity for its purposes. And at the same time, there's nothing. I mean, 25 years after the cuckoo's nest, I mean, there's nothing you can do online confident that your information or your data your identity is not subject to compromise. And in fact, the situation is so bad that the problems and the solutions we'll be talking about even 2 years from now haven't been invented yet. So how vulnerable are we? I mean, I think our vulnerability is complete.
And Eric, you've talked about the 2010 Chinese hacking of Google as a wake-up call, where your entire attitude actually changed. Have we arrived there yet when it comes to the world awakening to this threat, or are we still headed towards that day of reckoning, given our reliance, as Jane said, on these technologies now?
Well, as a rule, we know how to secure your data. We've just chosen not to do so. There are now technologies that allow you to encrypt the data at rest and in transmit that we're quite sure prevent foreign governments and indeed the US government to get access to it. Google and many of the other companies have implemented this. And if you follow the directions, I think you'll be fine for a while. Sometimes people make this argument by saying you can't trust the tech companies. And I obviously disagree with that. But as a technical matter, we know how to make the world safe and secure for interlopers.
I would just say, on this question of confidential computing, on this whole question of confidential computing, I agree with Eric. Of course, the answer is right. I mean, we also know that there are a number of things that all of us can do that don't require, the super high end, cybersecurity talent, for example. I mean, if you think about asset inventory, do companies or enterprises know what's on their networks and systems? No. Do they know what's running on their networks and systems? No. Do they know who has access to wander around their networks and systems and change configuration? No. Do they know that do they have secure configurations and where the deviations have been mapped? No. I mean, so to Eric's point, there's a lot we know about how to secure ourselves better. We're just not doing it.
Bob?
At the end of the day, Sherry, the business community, coming back to that, as well as countries, this goes both ways now, has these choices that Eric and Jane just talked about. There's choice around cost in terms of the techniques you can put in place and the artificial intelligence that allows you to deal with this stuff and move forward, and some of the choices that are made. And then the other trade-off, which is really important, is the concept of consumer experience and employee experience and citizen experience versus the other choice. And some countries take a different approach on that for various political reasons and other reasons in terms of culture. But at the end of the day, those are the choices that are there. So to your question, the answer is absolutely yes. The interdependency and interconnection is just prevailing everywhere. It got worse with COVID as you look at the transformation, because let's be clear, what COVID did was nothing more than accelerate the digitization that this world was already underway. And it just brought it forward for multiple years in a concise period of 9 months. This world was coming. And unfortunately, we just were not prepared in terms of the gap, just hit us square in the face with a 2x4. And the question now is, how do we adjust and repair the damage and also reconfigure the assets and make the choices to actually move forward in this new digit-enabled world in scale?
Let me bring in the geopolitical component here. And Ian, is there such a thing as cyber deterrence?
Sure. I mean, you think about how quickly we've been able to track Iranian attacks recently and respond as a consequence. The willingness to engage in multiple types of political and military responses and economic responses. You've got a wide range of tools that are at your command. I do believe that these things can be done effectively, but there's a big difference between cyber deterrence against a government actor and cyber deterrence against criminal actors. And when I think about the lack of focus, I mean, we know the massive efforts of cyber attacks by government actors against Pfizer and Moderna in the past months that were largely defeated by efforts of the US government working with those private sector firms and others. But I also look at the incredible ransomware attacks by criminal elements against the hospital system in Atlanta, for example, and others all over the place that people aren't paying attention to and that are almost impossible to deter. You have to take those actions yourself to make yourself not vulnerable to them, and we're not doing it. In part, it's inconvenient, it's expensive, it's difficult policies to put in place. But when I think about the need, we've got these vaccines that are rolling out, and you need to have a booster shot. You're going to have that information, effective, available, and online. I worry as we're rolling this out with localities and states and local hospitals that they're going to be very vulnerable to criminal elements. And maybe that's not as sexy as the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians coming after us. But if you're the one that can't actually get your system online, you don't really care where the attack comes from, right? So I worry about that a lot more in the near term.
Eric, what are your thoughts? Do you have similar concerns? And I know that you're actually in government advisory boards to boost tech innovation at the State Department as well. So I would like your thoughts on whether you've seen any progress on that front as well.
Well, what I have said over and over again is we know how to secure our systems. We just need to do it. And there are plenty of companies that can fix that. Assuming that you have security, then deterrence is defined making the path your opponent wants to take the less likely choice, the most painful choice. And we do not have a doctrine for deterrence. In the nuclear age, we ultimately settled on this mutually assured destruction, where there were a doctrine which essentially said both sides had to remain vulnerable in order to make sure the other did not attack preemptively. Because AI and cyber weapons are more likely first use than last use, it's not clear to me, and I've been working hard on this, how you achieve deterrence by interdependency. In other words, nuance would be to say that if you do something to us, that it'll be so painful to you, you won't do it again, and people therefore don't initiate it. The most likely deterrence is the interdependence that I foresee in this stable tension model. But we don't even have a language to discuss deterrence in the software age because it's quite different from traditional military tactics.
How do we get there? How do we get to that level of coordination, cooperation, and talking about this and building something out of what Eric just said? There's nothing right now, not even vocabulary.
So my doctor father at Stanford was Alexander George, who was a giant in American political science and essentially wrote the book on deterrence. And Eric's exactly right. I mean, there was a vocabulary both in conventional terms and in nuclear terms. And there was a certain automaticity. It's out of my hands. Your vulnerability and my vulnerability, we make certain moves. I mean, this is almost like Rappaport and game theory, right? Where there are optimal strategies for cooperation. But Eric's quite right in this current world. And so to begin to think about how to answer that, and this is perhaps the next great strategic question of our age. I mean, there have been 4 great strategic questions of my adult lifetime and just before. The great strategic question after World War II, where the world had suffered 2 massive world wars with countless, lives lost and destruction. The question was, how do we save succeeding generations from this level of destruction? And the answer was multilateralism. It was the UN, it was NATO, it was other international institutions. During the Cold War, where the only thing standing between us and the precipice, in the nuclear confrontation between the Soviets and the United States and involving the Chinese and other ascendant nuclear powers, the only thing standing between us and the precipice was our judgment. And so how did we begin to rein that in? Again, we used, multilateral institutions, treaties, and engaging numbers of others. At the end of the Cold War, the big strategic question, with the demise of the Soviet Union and the rise of the unipolar moment of the United States, the big strategic question that everyone was wrestling with is, gosh, the United States is that much more powerful than everyone else. What will it do with this power? Some people think the United States answered that question with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and they said, whatever we want. And the current question that the world has been grappling with is just how fragile is the American commitment to democratic values? And the question that Eric has now laid out is perhaps the great strategic question for all of us going forward.
So
Ian, your thoughts?
I want to raise a quick point on that. So, I think that the notion that mutually assured destruction is what maintained deterrence between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That's absolutely right. Let's keep in mind it was the only real common interest we had. Otherwise, we were competing over every square inch of territory. There was very little economic interdependence at all. We kind of wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, right? And ultimately it collapsed, and that was a win for the United States, at least short term. Now, if we were, I'm fairly convinced that we're not heading into a Cold War with China. And I think one of the reasons why is because if we were to enter that state, it would be a big strategic loss by both the Americans and the Chinese. And we both understand that. Our foreign policy establishments understand that. There's actually, we don't have mutually assured destruction. The Chinese aren't even building a major nuclear arsenal. But we do have vastly more interdependence between our 2 countries. We have enormous economic interdependence and trade interdependence. We have all sorts of other forms of diplomatic interdependence. The Chinese don't have global military, so they need the United States to provide levels of security in places like the Middle East for energy they want to have access to. Things like that. Having said that, most of the big geopolitical trends in the world right now are moving towards decoupling as opposed to coupling. That's clearly true in technology. It's also true to a degree when we talk about climate, in the sense that when you talk about coal and oil, gas, fossil fuels, you need global infrastructure for that. You need big armies for that. You need to coordinate a global market. When you move away from that, you start talking about things like solar and wind and electric vehicles, becomes much more decentralized. When you move away from labor, global supply chains, and suddenly instead you can produce anything with much less labor, it becomes more localized. Plus, we're talking about the competition in the technology field. So I do worry that as the level of mutual interdependence between the United States and China erodes, doesn't go away at all, but erodes, then the potential to deter attacks on each other also becomes more challenged. And that's a geopolitical environment that, again, is less stable than the technology environment we're talking about. That's more so.
So how do you square that with the idea that you had mentioned earlier? Say, for example, that you have this tech competition and whoever wins the tech race will also dominate which sort of values, whether democratic or authoritarian, will go into how you use those technologies, right? So how do you square those two off?
Eric wants it.
Yeah, so let's talk about the traditional concepts, which are containment, deterrence, detente, and mutual assured destruction. Containment is not possible. Deterrence is not defined. Detente is probably through interdependency, and mutually assured destruction is not possible. So we don't have a balance of how the nation states will work together. What is most likely going to happen is you'll have at least two regimes, which are the Chinese model and the Western model. And they represent different value systems, both of which work well. And Americans tend to decry the Chinese system, but it works quite well. So, for example, they don't have the misinformation and disinformation problem that we do because they have draconian policies about identity. So we have to start with a respect that the Chinese system, where they're leading in electronic commerce, they're many years ahead of the West in this regard. They're clearly well ahead in aspects of domestic security, which I don't particularly care for. And so we have to adapt our model to coexistence, understanding there will be more than one dominant platform and that it's a constant fight. And that's the way to think about it. And there will be next year's fight and a following fight. Current example, TikTok. Who knew that the most successful software app coming out of China would be TikTok and not WeChat? There will be another one and another one and another one.
Bob, what happens to those companies and even countries, third countries? Say you have extensive experience in Japan, stuck in the middle of all of this.
Listen, this point around codependence coexistence that Eric and Ian are talking about is the political and business challenge that this new form of leadership needs to learn how to adapt and adjust to. And this is the realities. When you step back and think about, I'll use PwC as an example. About 8 years ago, we spent a lot of time, actually Ian was part of this, thinking about what's the role of the US. Is it going to lead? Is it going to fall dramatically behind? Is it going to coexist? Or is it going to enable and try to lead as a group of two? And that's what Eric's talking about is I don't see any major shift, but I see a major transitionary period for the next 10 and 20 years of this coexistence in a world that has two different models, of which organizations and other countries that are one of those two are going to have to figure out how to navigate on any given day and any issue. And it's going to require a huge amount of skill in terms of the leadership to actually pull that off. And in that regard, a country like Japan has a big opportunity. Let's not all talk about the downside here, folks, right? The world that we are talking about is filled with tremendous opportunity. And I'm going to argue, like for Japan, they are actually in a pretty good spot. It's a difficult one, don't get me wrong. And the ministry has to manage its way through that. But if it can pivot and navigate and be agile in any given day, there's opportunity as you look at what's happening across Asia-Pac, the underlying demographics, and how Japan can play a role in it right now.
So let me now zero in from tensions in the macro level and geopolitics to tensions within countries, because of course, the biggest news this afternoon was the antitrust action against Facebook. And of course, we've had similar action from the DOJ in October against Google as well. Eric, you have talked about the likelihood that we will just see more tech regulation given the excesses of social media. What are your thoughts here? How will this end?
Well, I want to be clear to everybody that I think that antitrust is a particularly dull, not very precise regulatory, because the antitrust company victim of it organizes with lawyers to spend years and years and years in court over one thing or another. And by the time it all gets resolved, whatever the problem was has been addressed. The correct way to deal with the complaints that exist, which seem bipartisan, but at the moment are being brought by Republican governors and so forth, so God knows what that's about. The best way to do that is to come up with a regulatory regime that makes sense. These platforms can make mistakes. So using Facebook as an example, Facebook managed to anger people because they did too much sharing of bad and misinformation. That's a problem that they can solve. The fact that they didn't choose to solve it means that they can be regulated to solve it. It doesn't antitrust. And so I think what the problem is, you have a failure of government, because rather than having a thoughtful idea of how to regulate in a good way important platforms that are global in nature, you're putting them through an antitrust hammer at precisely the time when these companies need to gear up for the competition with China. So it's a bad public policy, is what I'm trying to say. There's a better way to do this.
Which is how?
Well, I'll give you my favorite current example, which is, and I'll talk about Amazon because I don't want to talk about Google. Amazon, I have trouble figuring out whether the Amazon product are their own products, third parties, or advertising. I mean, I honestly do, right? I'm dumb, whatever. And so that's an example where Amazon either needs to organize itself a bit better, or they'll get regulated because they're too important to have random stuff going on. The same argument in Facebook. What they should have done is they should have put in some form of ranking around sharing so that the kind of bad sharing that's going on of misinformation was damped down. Instead, their systems accelerate it. So part of the reason that the indictment of social networks is correct is that they are amplifiers. And they're amplifiers for the most extreme viewpoints. You can't have stable democracies when everything's a crisis and everything. We have to get back to some more principled ideas. So that's if the companies don't fit, will get regulated. And I think that's okay. And the regulation, by the way, there's plenty of regulators for these companies. The Federal Trade Commission, the FCC, so forth. Plus you can pass new laws. But do it through the legislative and regulatory process, not the antitrust process. The consequence of the Facebook Antitrust Act is nothing, right? It's just a lot of money and a lot of expense and a lot of drama, but it's not going to fix the underlying problem. Same issue with the Google one.
Which actually takes me to my next point, Ian, because we have seen these antitrust charges on Google as well in the EU, and that's led to fines of almost $10 billion. But now years later, there's an assessment that not a lot of competition has come out of that in the last few years. What do you think is going on there, and what do you think must happen here in the US?
Well, if you don't have any of those companies yourself, and you're trying to operate in a difficult fiscal environment, and there's a lot of unpopularity with big corporates in your country, the easiest thing to do is shake down foreigners, right? And so, of course, you're going to see lots of efforts to put fines against these companies. I understand that. And do I think that that's going to help the Europeans actually build out effective competitors to Facebook and Amazon and the rest? Absolutely not. By the way, I think that one of the reasons the Europeans are being so assertive and collective on the sustainability front is because they understand that they lost the ball game on big tech, no question. And so, yeah, there'll be efforts. There'll be people out there, and they're very capable regulators. They have real differences with the United States. Many of them are actually principal differences, and they do lead to better protections of privacy, for example. But they also create an environment where it's much harder to start corporations, where it's much harder to attract talent. And the difference between what Emmanuel Macron was saying about building out world-class artificial intelligence 2 years ago and what he's not saying right now, and that they can't do it and they need less regulation and more efficiency and need to lean into a stronger Europe. Sure, some of that is because his popularity is low and Merkel's going away and he sees his future as being a stronger European force. But some of it is a recognition that you just can't build those animal spirits inside Europe right now. It's just not possible. The fact that the United States, there are plenty of things to criticize the United States for. We're much more divided. Our political institutions are more captured by special interests. Their legitimacy is eroding. We're much more unequal. Those are problematic things. But American power, compared to our allies, has been expanding in the past years. That's true in terms of our tech companies in spades, in terms of our banks. It's true in terms of unleashing our fossil fuel companies. And by the way, massive increase in strength in fossil fuel companies under Obama and Biden. Why? Because they saw the political opportunity. The Europeans aren't doing any of those things. So no question it's going to cause difficulties for technology companies to operate. But ultimately, as someone who's thinking about this stable tech outcome that Eric is talking about, I think the Europeans will align very quickly with the United States, especially under the Biden administration. The real question is if you start seeing a failure in redistribution that Merkel and Macron is trying to drive, if the Polish government and the Hungarian government end up getting left out, and I hope that doesn't happen, you could see a bunch of countries in Eastern Europe that end up aligning much more with China. Why? Because they need the money. Because they need the money. But that's not where the French, it's not where the Germans, it's not where the UK is going, not at all.
Ian, aside, despite the underwhelming tech performance of European companies, what about the fact that the EU has taken the lead when it comes to privacy regulations? And of course, we have seen some of their frameworks really being adapted to, say, food safety and other areas. Could we see them shaping or taking a more active role in shaping the digital economy?
To the extent that Europe
can I
Please go ahead.
So I've spent 20 years working on European initiatives and entrepreneurship. And just to be totally obnoxious, when you meet with the European leaders, they talk about regulation. When you meet with the Chinese and the Americans, you talk about new companies, new growth, and so forth. If your goal is to regulate, then you'll never lead. You may lead in policy, but you won't build the platforms, and you'll always be in a position where you're regulating somebody else's opportunity. Europe is perfectly capable of providing global platforms. Once again, they've chosen not to. Sorry, Ian, I interrupted you.
No, look, that was better stated and more eloquent, and my point. So I completely agree.
We have about 2 minutes left. Right. Please go ahead, Jane.
As the person I led the U.S. side in the U.S.-EU negotiation on data exchange on PNR, passenger name records. It is the only data exchange agreement on scale that exists currently between the United States and Europe. We did it in 2012. It still exists. It survived Snowden. It survived audits by the European Union. It survived the safe harbor. What we're talking about is Europe as Brussels, not necessarily Europe as capitals. And I think there's a difference. I want to come back to 2 points that both Eric and Ian touched on, and Bob as well. One is, the economic model of the West has been built around the family for centuries, for at least 3 centuries. Facebook introduced a new economic model based around the friendship. Google introduced yet another economic model based around you and me. There's real fundamental change being introduced in the way societies organize and conceive of themselves that tech companies have played a part in. And so the fundamental issue now for governments is, what are governments good for? No one interacts with their government unless they have to. That's not the case with the private sector. And as we contemplate the interaction of so-called public-private partnerships, I can tell you from my own personal experience, no national government is getting it as right as states, governments, or as mayors are. We could learn a lot of lessons from them.
We have only a few seconds to go, but Bob, what are your thoughts, especially when it comes to the private sector?
Look, I love where Jane just went. The reality is, you come back to the government around the world and you have to ask yourself a question. How equipped are they actually to make policy? That policy could be either in rules and regulations, it's implicit in antitrust actions, which are just a blunt instrument that don't really progress the agenda other than to satisfy the citizens' needs and expectations for re-election purposes. And the question is, can't the business community, or at a lower level, those that are better informed, more equipped to do this, drive the agenda going forward? And that's why this public partnership is hugely important. And where the business community has got to step up now is actually be much more vocal, much more active, and much more influential in terms of trying to get both educated people at the table and the right decisions. And think about it in a geopolitical world that we've just been talking about for the last hour and a half, rather than a national or a protected world surrounded by geographic borders.
Bob, thank you so much. And thank you, Jane, Ian, Eric. This was a fabulous conversation, and we could go on forever, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much to Eurasia Group for hosting us as well. We'll leave it off for the roundtable that follows us. Thank you.